Welcome to tonight's event, Expanding Housing Choice in Clackamas County. This forum is produced and coordinated by the county's Department of Transportation and Development, or DTD. I'm Dylan Blaylock with Clackamas County's Public and Government Affairs Department, and I'll be coordinating public comments for tonight's meeting. Here's why we're here tonight. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed a bill to increase housing supply, housing choices, and housing affordability. In response, the county must allow middle housing, such as duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in urban areas currently zoned for single-family homes. The county must do this no later than June 30th of this year. Before making these code changes, the Clackamas County Planning Commission will hold a public hearing on Monday, March 28th, beginning at 6:30 p.m. This will be followed by the Board of County Commissioners holding a public hearing on Wednesday, April 27th, beginning at 10 a.m. I'm going to go ahead and pop that information into the chat now, just so you all have it. And there we go. People may provide testimony at one or both hearings and/or can submit written testimony before the hearings to Martha Fritzy by email to mfritzy@clackamas.us. I'll share this in a moment, or drop it off or send it by mail to Ms. Fritzy at 150 Beaver Creek Road in Oregon City, Oregon. All comments received before the hearings will be shared with the commissioners. I will also pop that information into the chat now. Tonight's event is an opportunity for the public to ask questions or share suggestions with project staff. Joining us tonight are Jennifer Hughes, Planning Director with DTD's Planning and Zoning Division, and Martha Fritzy, Principal Planner with the same division. My thanks to both of you for joining us tonight. The event will go until 8 p.m. or until we run out of comments and questions, whichever comes first. The session will be archived to YouTube. Here's how tonight's going to work. Ms. Hughes and Ms. Fritzy will provide a presentation with relevant background information that will run until a little before 6:30. At that time, I will instruct our attendees on how to provide live comment or ask a live question. You have a choice of asking your questions live via Zoom or over email. At any time during the presentation or after, you should feel free to email your questions or comments to my colleague, Ellen Roglin at ellenrog@clackamas.us. I will share her email address now in the chat and again later. Please know that we do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If your question is not addressed and Ellen has received it, someone will respond to you over the next several business days. If you are interested in receiving emails about the status of the project, you can also email Ellen as well. I'll also point out that we do have a project page. I'll share that link in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and share it with everyone now so they know what it looks like. I believe that's up. Expanding Housing Choice in Clackamas County, right there. And let me also go ahead and put that address in the chat. All right, sorry for all the housekeeping in the beginning. And with that, we're going to get started. Planning Director Jennifer Hughes will make a few introductory comments, and then Principal Planner Martha Fritzy will provide a presentation that will take us to a little before 6:30. Ms. Hughes.
Thanks, Dylan. Good evening, everyone. As Dylan said, I am Jennifer Hughes. I'm the Planning Director for the county. Both Martha Fritzy and I work in the Planning and Zoning Division. And I suspect there are some members of the audience who really haven't had cause to do business with the Planning and Zoning Division in the past. So just briefly, I wanted to say that really the core of what planning and zoning does is administer the county's zoning code, which is officially known as the Zoning and Development Ordinance. And basically that means we respond to questions from the public about how land and buildings can be used. And we review land use applications and building permits for consistency with the zoning code. We also draft and propose amendments to the zoning code, which is what we're here to talk with you about tonight. So in a few minutes, Martha is going to talk in some detail about what the proposal actually is that's before the county at this time. But first, I want to talk to you just briefly about what we're not doing with this project, because sometimes that's just as important as what we are doing. First of all, the county is not proposing to build any housing at this time as part of this proposal. I know, you all probably got the postcard in the mail, and sometimes the instinct is to think something's happening. The county's going to be building housing, or even that a private party is going to be building housing. My neighbor might be doing something. That's a pretty common question that we get. And so there is no specific development proposal that is part of this. What we are talking about is what might be possible in the future on property in Clackamas County, but nothing specific at this time as far as a development proposal. In addition, it's important to note that the county zoning code applies only in unincorporated Clackamas County, which is a fancy way of saying it does not apply inside city limits. So cities do have to comply with the same state regulations on middle housing that the county has to comply with, but they do that on their own. They have their own zoning codes, and we have no jurisdiction. So if you are interested in or own property inside city limits, our proposal will not apply to you directly. And then finally, I want to note that this proposal does not apply in rural areas. So we are only talking about the urban areas of Clackamas County, neighborhoods that are currently zoned primarily for single family dwellings. That's what the area that would be affected by this proposal. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the project manager, principal planner, Martha Fritzie.
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't appear to be able to share my screen.
Okay.
So
Fix
Ellen
that
or
real
Dylan.
quick. Yep,
Thank you.
Just one second. Yep. Oh, you know what, Ellen? It's got to be you. I'm sorry, Ellen. You've got to make Martha a co-host real quick. There we go. You should be able to do it now, Martha.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. Okay. That is not what I was trying to share. Sorry about that. Where is it? Aha. Okay. Is that the right one? Can I see a nod, Jennifer? Okay, thanks. So good evening. Sorry about that. After 2 years, you'd think I would know how to use Zoom better, but I clearly do not. So I'm going to go through hopefully a fairly brief PowerPoint presentation about what this specific proposal is and what specific zoning code changes we're discussing under this proposal. So first of all, we're calling this the middle housing. It's House Bill 2001 implementation, and it's allowing middle housing at certain urban unincorporated areas of Clackamas County. So before we even start talking about our zoning code, I just want to be clear what type of housing we're talking about. So what is middle housing? Generally, middle housing are those housing types that fall in between your detached sort of large single family home and the mid to high rise, pretty dense apartment or condo buildings. It can include a duplex, a triplex, townhouses, what in this graphic is called a courtyard apartment, what we and what the state are calling cottage clusters. And so the specific types of housing that we will be talking about today and as it relates to our zoning code are those identified in House Bill 2001, and they include duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes or quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters. And all of those types of housing must be allowed in the urban unincorporated single family neighborhoods. And so those are the neighborhoods that are in the zones listed here on the left, which may or may not mean anything to you. If you received a postcard, you likely own a property or a house in that zone. They are the neighborhoods that typically are developed right now with single family homes. There are these areas identified in yellow on this map here. And as Jennifer noted, the cities that are in gray, Happy Valley, Milwaukee, Lake Oswego, these others here, are all currently working on their own rules to implement House Bill 2001 and allow middle housing in single family areas in their jurisdictions. But these areas in yellow on this map here are the ones that our zoning code has jurisdiction over, and those are the areas that we're talking about today. And so here's some pictures of the various middle housing types to sort of get a visual idea of what we're talking about. to implement House Bill 2001 and allow middle housing in those various areas. We have a deadline. The county and all the cities have a deadline of June 30th, 2022. And by then, we have to either adopt zoning standards, change our zoning and development ordinance to be consistent with the state rules that we have to follow, or we could use something called the state's middle housing model code. It's a model zoning code that was written, at the state level that can be applied if we choose, and that will be applied if we do not do anything by June 30th, 2022. And there are some reasons why the county has decided not to just adopt the middle code. We are certainly using pieces from the model code, but there are certain decisions that can be made and certain regulations that we don't feel really fit in with our zoning code that are found in the model code. And there are other regulations that we would not be allowed to have that we think are important if we were to just simply adopt the model code. And so we are going down the road of changing our own zoning and development ordinance to allow, for the middle housing types. I apologize, I'm a little hoarse today for some reason. So we do have to stay within the parameters of state law when we're changing our zoning code to adopt or to allow for middle housing. And that means that there are certain rules that we have to follow. And so the state's rules are pretty prescriptive. We have no control over what housing types we have to allow, which were those middle housing types that were in the previous picture. We have no control over what zoning districts they have to be allowed in. That's in state law. And all the various middle housing types have to follow the same review process as a single family home would. And so that essentially means a building permit. We can't send them through any other land use applications unless we would do the same thing for a single family home. And then particularly when it comes to duplexes, like those pictured here, the standards for siting and design of duplexes are very prescriptive and essentially have to be exactly the same as those for a single family dwelling. And so there are a few things that the county has control over. And some of those things are identifying how big a site can be for middle housing to be developed. There's some ability to regulate the amount of parking that's required, although we do need to stay within the limits of what the state law tells us. And there's some limited ability to have flexibility with some of the siting and design standards around certain middle housing types. And by siting, I mean exactly where or how big the buildings can be, where they can be located on a lot. And by design standard, it's really about how the buildings look. So since we do have some choices in some of the regulations, we have embarked on a long process of asking people what they think, of having discussions with various decision-making bodies, and doing a fair amount of public outreach over the last 9 or 10 months. We've had a couple of work sessions with our Planning Commission and at least one with our Board of County Commissioners. We've engaged in some public outreach, which included a couple of surveys and a number of discussion group meetings with various communities, paying particular attention to multicultural communities, those communities that don't typically show up in the land use process. And we're really trying to branch out and reach more people and get more people interested and involved in land use and what's going on in their communities. And so this meeting is part of our public outreach. We did send out those postcards to over 21,000 property owners. Every property that is directly affected by House Bill 2001. And we have gotten a good response out of that. And I hope that we've gotten some new people to the table here today to start learning about land use and how to be involved in these kinds of decisions. And so Generally speaking, we've so far had a very mixed response to middle housing. There are those who are very, very excited about it. We've talked a lot about benefits, and by far the most common benefit mentioned is the ability to increase the amount of affordable housing. And we're talking about affordable housing, not subsidized affordable housing, but just housing that is more affordable for people to buy or rent, simply because it is smaller, there's more units potentially on a property. It's less expensive to build than the big single family home. And so it's a housing type that is naturally more affordable. And that's what we're talking about with affordable housing. And that's what we're talking about when we say it would provide more choices for people in certain neighborhoods. Some other benefits that have been mentioned are it would provide potentially more options for home buyers. It would certainly could be a source of additional income for a landowner if somebody has a home and they want to add some units and have them be rentals. It could help somebody buy a property if there's another unit on the property to supplement their mortgage payment, but because it's a rental. And there's a feeling generally that middle housing can be attractive and compact, and it may even attract more local businesses to neighborhoods if there's a little bit more density. There are, of course, concerns, and by far the most commonly mentioned concerns were about possibly overcrowding in neighborhoods and concerns about parking. Some other concerns we've heard are impacts to open space and possibly damaging land if we're putting more development on it. And then we did hear some concerns, particularly from some of our survey respondents, about changing neighborhood character. And so with all that in mind, we understand, and I think everybody understands, there's definitely benefits to allowing middle housing, but some of the concerns we can directly tie into our regulations as we're changing our zoning codes. So as we are thinking about changing our zoning codes, we think about what do we want to do. So we know that the state law is pretty prescriptive about a lot of things, but we do have some flexibility with some of our standards. And so one of the conversations that we've had with a lot of our focus groups and discussion groups and decision makers is really, where do we want to just allow, essentially just allow middle housing and follow the rules, the minimum compliance that we have to do to allow this, and not really provide a lot of flexibility for middle housing? Or do we want to write some rules that would provide more flexibility for middle housing and perhaps encourage or even incentivize middle housing? And again, we got a very mixed response from everyone we've talked to. About half and half, really in support of providing a lot of flexibility versus not providing any flexibility. I think that some feel it is definitely a trade-off in order to increase the amount of housing choice and affordable housing. But I can say even those that supported some flexibility really supported no flexibility when it comes to parking requirements and whether or not those who are developing should build sidewalks on roads if they don't exist. And so these are all things that we have kept in mind as we're working on drafting our regulations. And so what does that look like, drafting our regulations? So Jennifer mentioned our zoning code is actually called the Zoning and Development Ordinance, or ZDO for short. We have drafted a number of amendments to our zoning and development ordinance. Currently, our ZDO, I think, has about 80 different sections, and we are proposing to amend about 21 of those to incorporate middle housing into our zoning code. And it's not simply a matter of allowing middle housing, although that is one of the things that the changes do. It's also clarifying which development standards apply to middle housing. And as part of that, we are including an entirely new section to our ZDO that talks specifically about triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, and some specific siting and design standards that we are allowed to have for those. It identifies what parking requirements are for middle housing and what sidewalk requirements are for middle housing, as well as other housing. And then it allows for land to be divided if middle housing is built on it. And that is something that was not required under House Bill 2001, but it was required under a different piece of legislation. And so we need to, beginning in July, the county will have to allow lots that are developed with middle housing to be divided under this thing called a middle housing land division. So we are taking the opportunity to incorporate that into our zoning codes now, rather than having to come back and do that later. And so these are sort of the big items that the zoning code changes are addressing. It is important to keep in mind, again, I think Jennifer mentioned this, maybe not, this process will not rezone any properties. So if your property is currently zoned R10, it will stay zoned R10. What would happen is that you would potentially be allowed to build more houses on your property than just the single family dwelling that might be there right now. And so there are some other ZDO amendments that are related to housing that staff is proposing also. These are not requirements under House Bill 2001 or under that other legislation that allows for middle housing land divisions, but they're things that we feel are important to change in our zoning code for a number of reasons. One is to support middle housing development. So, for example, removing this 3,000 square foot minimum lot size for residential development is something that's in our zoning, that has been in our zoning code for decades and decades. And we don't even know really where it came from. And it essentially means that if you have a lot that is less than 3,000 square feet, if you happen to have one, you could not develop on it right now. And House Bill 2001 appears to require us to allow a duplex on it now. And so it doesn't make any sense that you wouldn't be allowed to put a single family home on it as well. And so we're clarifying things like that in our zoning code. There is a proposal to increase the amount of lot that can be covered by development, like the footprint of your house and accessory structures. In a lot of our zones right now, it's 40% of the lot. We're proposing to increase it to 50% of the lot. Some lots already allow for that. There's this list of exceptions, and it just is easier to administer if we just had one lot coverage without having to have exceptions. And then the final one is a bit of an oddity. It's not really related to House Bill 2001 or middle housing at all, but it's related to some legislation that we think is likely to pass in this year's legislative session, where we're not even allowed to have some of the regulations. We won't be allowed to have some of the regulations that we have around manufactured homes. And so we're just proposing right now to repeal those. And effectively, that would mean that a manufactured home could be allowed to be used as middle housing, as an accessory dwelling unit or in a cottage cluster. And that's something that our standards currently wouldn't allow. But that would be one implication of repealing some of these unique standards for manufactured homes. And then along with changes to our zoning code, we are making changes to our comprehensive plan. And the county's comprehensive plan is really a framework document for land use, and the ZDO implements the comprehensive plan. It consists of goals and policies. It is not as regulatory of a document as the zoning code, but it is enabling. And so because we're making so many changes to our zoning codes, we need to take a look at our goals and policies that are found in our comprehensive plan and make sure not only that they are up to date, but they also are enabling what they need to enable. And so that will involve some pretty substantial changes to our housing chapter, as you can imagine, because we're going from only allowing single family in certain areas to allowing all these different housing types. and a couple of minor changes to some other chapters. And so we have posted at this website here, and I can paste that into the chat at some point, a link to all of the draft ZDO and comprehensive plan amendments. And so you are welcome to look through them on your own. I can tell you it's a lot. If you've never read a zoning code before, it's difficult sometimes. Sometime in the next week or two, we will also have posted summaries of all the changes for each section to help guide you through it, and it might be easier to get through that way. But keep in mind also that these are draft amendments, and while we think substantively they are not going to change a whole lot, they still are subject to some change. And so we're happy to hear any feedback that you have on those if you can get through them. And then Dylan mentioned there's a couple of public hearings coming up. We do have a public hearing before our planning commission. That's the first decision-making body that has to consider the changes to the zoning code and the comprehensive plan. And the planning commission will hold a public hearing at which people can come testify. And by come, I believe that it would only be on Zoom for the planning commission, but you can certainly come testify. You can submit written testimony in advance to me, to my email address listed there, and I'll be happy to forward that to the planning commission. If the planning commission does need another hearing, if we can't get through all the testimony or they want to discuss it more, we will have another hearing on April 11th. The Board of County Commissioners, the Planning Commission then makes a recommendation of approval or denial, or recommends changes to the Board of County Commissioners. And the Board of County Commissioners ultimately will make the decision about what changes we're making to our zoning code and the comprehensive plan. The first hearing before the Board of County Commissioners is scheduled for April 27th. Again, oral testimony will be accepted at that hearing, and written testimony can be sent to me. We have a couple of dates in May that are held if the Board of County Commissioners decides to hold more than one public hearing on the matter. And then finally, Dylan shared with you our webpage. There's a lot of information on that webpage that's listed up here on the top. A lot of background information, past meetings. There are videos and recordings from past meetings and meeting material. And then of course there is Ellen's email address if you want to be put on the interested parties list for this particular project. You will receive email updates, you'll receive notifications of when the hearings are happening and when other changes happen with the project, when certain decisions are made. And so that is the end of my presentation. And I think we're ready for questions.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Fritzy. And the rest of our evening is devoted to answering questions from and taking comments from the public. If you have a comment to make, please use the raise hand function on Zoom. It will let me know you'd like to share your comment or ask a question to our panelists. If you're on the phone, and we do have someone on the phone, you are welcome to hit *9, and that lets me know that you would like to raise your hand and to call on you. Again, at any time during the presentation or after, you should feel free to email your question to my colleague Ellen Roglin at ellenrog@clackamas.us. I believe she just recently she put it right in the chat as well. It's the same email address when you want to be added to the email list. So, and we'll share her email address a couple more times throughout tonight's event. So that is it. Let me go ahead and check real quick. I see that we do have a hand raise. Again, if you would like to go ahead and pose a question or make a comment, you feel free to raise your hand. It can be on the top or bottom of your Zoom app, depending on your device. And I see a couple. I think we're going to go ahead with the standard just time limitation of 3 minutes per speaker, at least for the first go rounds. So we will keep to that. The first hand I see up is just, the handle is simply Jeff. So Jeff, if that is your handle, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Very good. And you are on for up to 3 minutes. Go right ahead with your comment or question. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. My question is, I currently own a roughly a $20,000 square foot property. And I'm wondering, what will I be allowed to do with these changes? There's a home at the front portion, and obviously the old standard would be a single family home behind us as a flagpole, but it looks like the ideal would be duplex, triplexes. We could stack a few, potentially up to 6 addresses. How do I go about accomplishing that on this? And we're near Lowe's, we're near a school, we're near other apartments. I mean, we're near high density already, and we're just like about 3 or 4 of us that have pretty large lots in this area. So I want to maximize that potential of the property.
Okay. So do you happen to know what zoning district you're in?
It is R10.
R10, okay. So the zoning won't change. What potentially would be allowed is on a parcel of that size, you would be allowed to do any of the middle housing types that were listed. A duplex, triplex, quadplex, townhomes, or cottage cluster. And so the type that you develop would be up to you to some extent. I mean, your property is potentially dividable into 2 lots, each lot roughly 10,000 square feet. Each lot would be allowed to have middle housing on it.
So you're talking 1 fourplex then per lot on the max,
Yes.
or you're talking multiple fourplexes?
1 fourplex per lot.
Okay.
There is, however, if you can, I mean, there are certain standards you have to meet. You still have to meet, setbacks from your property lines. You have to provide parking, and the requirement will be 1 parking space per dwelling unit. You can only cover a certain percentage of your lot. So you do need to meet all the development standards, but each lot would be allowed 1 quadplex or 1 triplex or 1 duplex, or a cottage cluster, which has a minimum of 4 dwelling units around a courtyard. But if you can actually fit more in there, you could build more than 4 units.
Excellent.
So I think the first step would be to partition the property into 2.
Okay.
Or figure out how this middle housing land division is going to work, which is something you should certainly talk with the planning department about, because we're still figuring that out in our zoning code.
Okay, well, yeah, this is definitely my first dive into what you guys are doing, so it's exciting for everybody, really. So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. Again, if you have a question or comment for the panel, go ahead and select the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I will get to you. Next up is the handle is Michael French. Michael French, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go.
Go right ahead.
A couple questions. Currently in a subdivision, a small HOA, and the zoning is R10. Everybody froze. That's interesting. Hopefully everybody unfreezes. Okay, there we go. So small HOA, it's established in the HOA rules about a certain minimum building size of a single family. Would this override those rules and allow other housing on that particular size of the subdivision? So that's question 1. Question 2 is, when would this zoning change take place? In other words, there's a property next to me that's currently it's in the process of being subdivided. Would it be allowed up until or only after July 1st, when the new zoning changes take place, that it would be changed from currently only allowing a single family to the new zoning regulations?
So I'm just going to hop in. I'm actually answering the second question first because it's easier. These changes will take place on or before July 1st of this year. So that is our deadline. We have to allow it as of July 1st. If we go through our process and can adopt our zoning code changes before then, it would be effective before then. I can tell you with our schedule of hearings and adoption, it's not likely to be much before July 1st, if at all. But certainly July 1st. And so HOAs, that is a very interesting question. And House Bill 2001 was very clear that nothing about existing HOAs, whether they specifically prohibit middle housing, or it sounds like you have some minimum house sizes in yours. Nothing about this legislation changes those existing HOA rules. It talks about future HOAs and not being able to prohibit specific things, but it is not retroactive to existing HOAs. And Jennifer may have a little more articulate insight on that. No,
I think you got it exactly right. It's not retroactive. I mean, there is a distinction. The county does not enforce HOAs. They are private agreements among property owners. But we would certainly never counsel anyone to, to submit something that violated their HOA rules, because you certainly could be subject to, to civil action. But they are not county standards. And yeah, moving forward, there are restrictions on what homeowners associations can prohibit, but at least so far, it's not retroactive. I don't know whether there would ever be any potential for new state legislation that would change that. But at the moment, your HOA rules would remain intact.
Very good, thank you. Just a clarification on question 2. So the property that's now currently in submission for the subdivision, creating about a 13,000 square foot lot, could it, while it's in revision, then be approved for the middle housing as it's in process? Or would the permit process is already submitted, but the building permits are not submitted, just the subdivision, the lot division?
So we would not approve a building permit for middle housing until July 1st, or like I said, if our rules became effective before then. But the land division is simply, it must just be allowed under the existing zoning right now.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you very much for that, Michael. There we go. I'm also just going to pop in the chat again, if you would like to not talk on Zoom, but you wanted to relay your question over email, you can email Ellen Roglin at the email address I just shared. All right, next up, we are going to go to Michael Dawkins. Michael, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself. There we go, and you are on for 3 minutes. Go right ahead.
Good evening. Thank you for having this forum. So a couple questions. Is the transit connected location, is that going to be within a quarter mile of a bus line or max? Is that going to affect the density? I read a proposal for City Milwaukee where they were talking about 60% of your lot being covered instead of 50. I didn't know if that was something you were considering adopting.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not familiar with Milwaukee's proposal. Our middle housing proposal does not have different standards based upon how close you are to transit.
Okay.
So
so because I have an acre that is close to some newer developments that I'm R10, but it's close to R7. And the justification to transit said that I could get a change to R7. Would that be a beneficial step at this point, or is it better to wait to see what the middle housing land division will play out?
So there is a correlation between transit proximity and zone changes. That's not the only criterion, but you're correct. There's a relationship there. I guess my advice would be that before you file an application for a zone change, that you would, first of all, you're required to do a pre-application conference. That's the first step. And I think it'd be appropriate to talk about all of your middle housing options.
Okay.
Because honestly, in the current, we're still trying to wrap our heads around this because we're so used to thinking as planners for so many years in terms of, well, this is R7 and this is R10 and this is R5, and this is what it means for density. And with this middle housing, it really turns all of that on its ear. And so you may find that you have the ability to get as many units as you would want or could fit on that site under the current zoning without the extra sort of expense and process of going through a zone change. But it really depends upon what you want.
Okay.
So I would talk to a planner first.
Okay.
Because it's hard to get real specific without us looking at a map and figuring out exactly what property we're talking about and all of that. But I think you're right to be considering your alternatives, and it may turn out that for some folks, zone changes just don't make sense anymore, you know,
Right.
depending on what you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. One last quick question. Previously, tiny homes were not allowed in the county. So a tiny home that's built to code, actually, it's built even above code requirements. Is that something that would be allowed now? And what would be the minimum lot size that would be allowed for a tiny home? Sorry, it's a tough question.
No, Martha and I are laughing because it just, again, it's an inside planner joke about tiny homes, not because they're bad at all, but because our zoning code doesn't require houses to be a certain size. And so the answer mostly for people is, well, sure, you can build a tiny home. It's just most people, when they ask that question, they mean they really want multiple, right? They're not talking about putting one tiny home on like a 20,000 square foot lot. So I think the answer is, aside from building code issues, which we don't regulate, but it's my understanding that the building codes have generally become a little friendlier to some of these tiny homes, but there may be still this question about what's an RV, what's a home, what's, you know, all of that. Yeah. We don't regulate that part. But there may be more ability now to do tiny homes through these cottage clusters that we're talking about. And then to actually have those potentially as separate lots through a middle housing land division, or to, you know, they could all still function as one project. They could be condos, you know, there's a number of different options. And so I would see there being some more feasibility, I guess, if you will, to tiny homes than what we had when it was like, well, sorry, your lot's 20,000 square feet. Most people are not going to just put like a 200 square foot dwelling on that because it's not what the market's going to demand, right?
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, and if I could just add, you know, what Jennifer's talking about is a tiny home that does meet building codes and that is on a foundation. We're not talking about tiny homes on wheels. Correct. Those essentially in our eyes, and I think still in the state's eyes, are RVs.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the comment and question, Michael. Next up, we actually have a phone call. So let me see. If your phone ends in 683, you can go ahead and hit *6 to unmute. So, and you will be on in a second, as long as you do that again. If your phone, there we go. Go ahead and you're on for 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Hey, do I understand this correctly that low income housing units will not be in the middle housing? Hello?
I'm so it's not necessarily. If a developer comes in and proposes to develop middle housing and wants to develop it as low income housing, they certainly can. I was trying to make a distinction between housing being more affordable sort of naturally, you know, in the market versus what some people call, you know, think of affordable housing as income restricted, low income subsidized housing. Nothing in middle housing would prevent a developer from developing it as low income housing, subsidized housing, income restricted. But this proposal is not specifically about that type of low income housing.
So if it was low income housing, it would have to be like a duplex, triplex, townhouse, fourplex. cottage clusters like you explained?
Um, in any zoning district that allows housing, any type of housing can be developed as low-income housing if a developer wants to. So in this instance, allowing more middle housing, these triplexes, quadplexes, duplexes, would just allow different types of housing that could be developed as middle housing.
Right, but it wouldn't be like a 60 apartment unit complex.
Not
Type
in
thing.
these zoning districts, no. Those are allowed in other areas in the county.
Got it, got it. And so, and would this not include in middle housing apartment complexes like 2 to 3 units high?
Those would be duplexes or triplexes. And so a duplex or a triplex could be side by side, or they could be stacked. So they could be apartments for rent, or there could be condos for sale.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Martha, there's still going to be the 35-foot height limit. Is that
Yes.
accurate?
Yes.
So the standard currently for building height for single family is 35 feet. And on a flat lot, just to make it simple, that's measured to the midpoint between the eaves and the peak of the roof. So, you know, you can get a fairly tall single family house. Really, most of them aren't 35 feet. But that's the same standard that we would be applying. So no, we're really not looking at multi-story. Now, one thing I will say, and you know, honestly, I don't know, Martha, if we're even really prepared to talk about this, but there is legislation that offered some density bonuses for that's different than this middle housing. And we're honestly trying to still wrap our heads around what that authorizes for certain types of affordable housing. So it's possible there could be some ability to get either more units, or there's even a standard written about height being increased. It's not clear that part would really apply in our case. So I don't want to say, gee, there's absolutely no chance that you could see this. But what I will say is that this particular project that we're talking about is not about multi-story apartment complexes. It's about, like Martha said, maybe up to a fourplex with that same 35-foot height limit that would apply to a single family dwelling.
Got it. And then my last question is, on Stevens Road, across from the old New Hope Church, there's a very, very large parcel being developed. Do you know what's going in there?
I don't, and it might be in the city of Happy Valley. I need to look at a map. Part of that area has been annexed to Happy Valley. Martha, I don't know if we can check it and try to either respond here in a little bit or put it in the chat, but I need to kind of look at a map and see. But you said it's right across, so right across Stevens Road from New Hope?
Right, it's on Stevens Road, and it's east of the old New Hope Church.
Okay, some of
But
that area is in the city of Happy Valley now, so it could be theirs. It's not ringing a bell with me, but I don't pretend to know every development in unincorporated Clackamas County either, so we should look.
It's east of Stevens. Is it between Monterey and Causey? Do you know?
It's, let's see, it is south of Causey. South of Causey, Monterey. And it's south of Monterey. But it's more for practical purposes. It's right on Stevens Road and directly east of the old New Hope Church. Big, big, big parcel.
I'm fairly certain those properties are in the city of Happy Valley.
Because
If I'm
I
looking
think
at
the area right now is not
Go-
city of Happy Valley.
Right, but the area east of Stevens that is north of like the commercial development along Stevens, and so in between Monterey and the commercial development is all in the city. So that development would be happening through the city.
Interesting.
If you want us to verify that for sure, you're welcome to use my email address also, just to shoot me that question and send a specific address, and I can verify that with you offline.
Yeah, there's no specific address because they just, they're still in the soil process. But yeah, that's
Okay.
great. I will contact you.
And will you
And
tell me
thank
your
you, and
name
that's
is,
all I-
just so I know who I'm looking for an email from?
Lynn.
Lynn. Okay, thank you.
All right, very, very good. Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate that. Let's see, next we are going to go to Heather Andrews. Heather, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Very good. And you're on for 3 minutes here. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Heather Andrews. I live in the very northernmost part of the county in sort of what would arguably be called urban. I'm a homeowner. I've lived here my entire life. I'm in my mid-40s now. And I just want to say thank you. I mean, I know that this was sort of state mandated and everything, but I'm one of those weirdos who has sort of a regular single family lot. However, my house has been failing for a very long time, but I've not had really many options. So now these are new options that are going to be available to me theoretically, because, I did, when I was just getting out of graduate school 10 years ago, I didn't have, $150,000 to just, demolish my house and build a new one. And it turns out that the new one that I'd like to build is actually probably now going to be within parameters, like after this change, within the parameters of these changes, or addressed by these changes. So my interest in this matter is purely, I mean, I guess it's self-interest in the other way that other people have been self-interested, but mine's not for profit. Mine is for my quality of life. Because I have been here a really long time and I'd like to stay here, but there's only so much I can do. So I've been living in subpar housing for 20 years now, because I actually moved into this particular house, which it used to belong to a family member, but I moved in here in 1999. So that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your work and have a great day.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Heather.
Thanks, Heather.
Great. Next, we're going to go to Connie Elkins. Connie Elkins, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself. There we go. And you're on for 3 minutes here. Go right ahead.
Good evening. Thank you for the excellent clarification. And my question is, I'm here as an interested homeowner off of Johnson Creek Parkway at the top of Mount Scott. Our HOA are the condos. Is this going to affect us in any way?
So are you in the condos that are up at Altamont? Is that
Exactly.
correct? Okay.
Yes.
So I think the answer is probably no in terms of the condo site. Altamont in general would be, aside from the homeowners association, eligible for middle housing. I wouldn't be surprised if the homeowners association has some restrictions, which would be, as we said earlier, it's not retroactive to those existing homeowners associations. So, you may not see middle housing developed in the Altamont subdivision. The condo site itself, I wouldn't see being available for something additional. What I can't remember, there may be some leftover, for want of a better word, density in Altamont. I don't recall whether they built developed every single lot they could have. So I suppose there's still the potential there could be some kind of like new development up there somewhere, but I don't know exactly where that would be. So, I don't have enough information to tell you for sure. But I guess I would expect it to have pretty limited applicability, particularly to the condo site, just based on what I know.
Okay. I know there's land below us. Pardon me. And I'm not even sure who owns that land, if that's part of the cemetery or if that can be developed.
Yeah, so your best bet there would be to contact us again offline. You could email Martha and she could refer it. She may not respond to every one of these herself, but we can have someone look into that, because it's going to kind of depend on which lot, how it's zoned, whether it is really like some sort of, there's a lot of common area up at Altamont that's not, you know, it's open space for the development, it's not developable. But I'm just not sure whether maybe there's still a little bit up there that could theoretically be subdivided. And so in that scenario, if there is some, then yes, that land would theoretically be able to be developed with middle housing instead of single family, if that's what they decided, you know, if that's what the property owner decided to do. But at this point, I'm really just speculating.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Connie. Okay, next I'm going to relay a couple emails that we've gotten so far. Again, if you have a question and you don't feel comfortable saying it over Zoom, you can go ahead and email Ellen Rogg. That address is in the chat. From Seashells, are the zoning code changes address? Maybe do the zoning code changes address the potential for demolition of housing in an R7 zone? How will lot coverage and intensity affect stormwater runoff where retention ponds are not feasible? Has this intensification been factored into wastewater processing through West facilities? So again, just to repeat, do the zoning code changes address the potential for demolition of housing in an R7 zone? How will lot coverage and intensity affect stormwater runoff where retention ponds are not feasible? Has this intensification been factored into wastewater processing through West facilities?
So I'll jump in and start with what I wrote down here, and then I may have Jennifer help me out a little bit. So I'm not entirely sure what is meant by the question about addressing demolition of existing homes. There is nothing in the zoning code amendments that specifically address that, but there are things in the code amendment that specifically allow an existing home to remain on a property. It can be converted internally to a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex if that's possible. It could also be one of the dwellings that's included in a cottage cluster, but it also could be demoed and something completely new built on the property. So maybe that's a no. There's nothing in there that specifically addresses demolition, but we do try to address the retention of the house. And when it comes to stormwater and sewer, I think the last question was about wastewater. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, when it comes to services like sewer or potable water service, we have service districts. We have talked to them about middle housing. And I think there is an understanding that particularly in unincorporated Clackamas County in the urban area, there's already a lot of development. And so anything new that's coming, or most of the new development that would be coming would be infill, and it's going to happen at a pretty slow rate. And so our service providers who provide sewer and water services have expressed that they are not concerned about being able to handle the additional, or that they have the capacity to handle the additional development, with this assumption that it's going to be, a slower infill rate type of development. Stormwater is a really good question. And this is where I may need a little bit of help. So my understanding of what happens when somebody comes in for a building permit or to develop a property is that the service district responsible for stormwater review, which in some cases is the Water Environment Services that she mentioned, reviews the development and makes sure that whatever's being developed on the site meets their standards for stormwater retention. And I believe the intent is to keep most of the stormwater and surface water on the property and have it handled within the property. When stormwater runs off into roads, there are facilities in the roads that are intended to handle that as well. And so through the building permit process, all of our service providers do look at whether or not what is being proposed will meet their standards. And so I don't know if that is sufficient to answer your question, or if Jennifer has anything to add to that.
I think that's all accurate. I was just kind of smiling because we had a conversation this morning, Martha and me and some other project staff, about this question of whether, I mean, there's this idea, of course, that there's going to be this infill, and not just in Clackamas County, but across the state, really, to address what is, I think, a real legitimate housing shortage. But because of stormwater, we were sort of questioning this morning, well, how much of this can happen with the requirements? There are, more significant requirements for taking care of stormwater than there used to be, justifiably so. And as a result of that, it's that sort of push-pull of how do you accommodate that while also getting this infill? You kind of got these competing policy priorities. So I think there is, that is going to have to kind of sort itself out. We don't directly apply the standards to building permits in planning. And so we don't have really all the technical knowledge. We just generally understand that, yes, there's this process that whoever the Surface Water Management Authority is going to look at the building permit. But we're actually hoping to get a little more educated on that question ourselves in the next few weeks before the hearings, because we think these questions are going to come up. And even though it's sort of not our department, we ought to know the answer. So it's a great question. I don't have all the answers, but I think generally what Martha said is correct, that it will be evaluated and they will have to meet the current standards for surface water.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you to the emailer. There we go. We'll go back to the Zoom lines. Next up is going to be Casey Cutting. Casey Cutting, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. There you go. And you're on for 3 minutes. Go right ahead. Okay, Casey, if you're there, we cannot hear you. So maybe try to unmute yourself or unmute yourself again. It might be a microphone problem. That's usually what it is in these sort of things, in these sort of situations. Pardon me. Okay. Casey, I'm going to move you back and try to bring you in next because we cannot hear you. So well, Casey's trying to sort that out. We will go to Carolyn Krebs. Carolyn Krebs, you are on. If you can go and unmute yourself. Very good. And you're on for 3 minutes. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping to find out a little bit more information about the land division issue that you raised earlier in the meeting. I have an R10 property in unincorporated area of Lake Oswego. So I'm in the urban service district for Lake Oswego, but in unincorporated Clackamas County. And I want to understand a little bit about what you're looking at as the requirements for land division and what those options are. Can you explain that?
I can certainly try. And so your location being outside of Lake Oswego is a little different from some of the other areas that we're talking about, because I don't think you have sewer service, do you? You're not in a sewer district?
No, I do not. I'm probably within 300 feet of a sewer line, but a sewer extension onto my property is prohibitively expensive for most of the people on my street. What we understand would be those costs. So that's one of the reasons why I'm asking in Clackamas County, because I don't honestly believe we're going to see sewer on this street in my lifetime.
Okay. So your property and the ones similarly situated that are not in a sewer district and don't have access to sewer and are located outside of Lake Oswego are in a bit of a unique situation. And so our zoning code does not allow for property to be divided in that area unless they connect to sewer, or if sewer is not, this term, legally and physically available to you. So to connect to sewer, you would have to annex to Lake Oswego. And Lake Oswego would be the one that would have to say that sewer is not legally and physically available to you. If that were the case and you were zoned and had enough land to divide the property, we would allow you to do it using on-site wastewater systems or septic systems. But it would only be allowed in the case where the city found that the sewer is not legally and physically available. With that said, it also relates to middle housing, because on your lot now, or if you are able to divide without sewer, you would be allowed to build a single family dwelling or a duplex, assuming you could, again, meet the development standards and you could put a septic system on the property that could fit and meet all of the appropriate standards. You would not be able to build a triplex, quadplex, or the other middle housing types unless you actually were on sewer.
Okay, thank you. That helps a lot. I've been reading through the materials that are on the website, and I do have a question about the natural resource protection. I'm in an area, we call it the Lake Forest neighborhood because it's a forest, and we have a significant number of trees. I have a significant number on my smaller lot, and we are, like a lot of people in the county, interested in preserving our trees as much as possible. And I have some concerns about what I'm hearing are the changes of lot coverage, and how that might impact the ability to preserve resources on the lot. Has the county been considering the trade-off of those values?
Well, let me jump in. So the first question, I guess, is what rules would apply to tree removal for middle housing? And the answer is it depends on the location. If, for example, there's a protected stream that runs through a particular piece of property wherein there is a buffer required and tree removal is regulated, those regulations would apply to middle housing development the same way they apply to single family development. It doesn't mean they can't build on the property, but it does mean that there is a limitation in terms of the disturbance area, and there's a process that they have to go through to do that, neighbor notification, et cetera, if they're going to be in one of those buffers. In the absence of that type of a protected water feature, the county's current tree preservation regulations are problematic. They are what we call discretionary or not clear and objective. And it is very clear under state law that we are prohibited from applying them to residential development. That's already true. So it will continue to be true with middle housing. There is a subsequent phase of this housing project that is going to look at those standards that we have right now that we can't apply, and consider whether to do, different standards that would be clear and objective. That's a very complex process with, I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of potential disagreement among community members as to what we should do.
Sure.
But that is on the list. But in the short term or middle term, there isn't going to be anything that would say somebody couldn't build a duplex if it meant they were going to cut down a tree on the property, unless they're in one of those water buffer areas. And yes, we have thought about it, and we just don't have a great solution right now because of the kind of the deadline we're under and the reality of our current tree code. The other thing you raised about lot coverage, yeah, I think that's also a concern. Lot coverage technically in the county deals with structures, not with pavement. So in theory, people could already kind of, pave their whole lot. But I think there is this question about whether there'll be more sort of motivation, to fill more of the lot than there would be with a single family home. I could go either way with that. We've seen a lot of really big single family houses on relatively small lots in the last 20 years. So I'm not sure. But I think your point is a good one. And the difficulty we run into is that we have limits under these state rules about what we can and can't require. And so to sort of say, oh, well, from now on, if you build middle housing, you have to have a certain percentage of landscaping, or you have to, we're not really in a position to be able to have those standards unless we look at imposing those on single family as well. And at the moment, that's not part of this project. So we are a little bit trapped, I guess, by those circumstances.
So, and I'm sure it goes beyond the scope of what you're doing to be looking at how your single family zoning might change because of the impacts of having middle housing need to meet those minimum standards. And that's, I guess that's where I'm sitting, where I could see a reason for asking the county to maintain their lot coverage at 40% rather than consider, that increased because of the unintended consequences of potentially losing more natural resources than we already are. I do understand that there's two sides of this question. I'd happen to fall on the side of loving the trees in my neighborhood and the resource protections that and habitat protections that they allow. And so that's where I'm coming down on this. I know that the state, it sounds like from reading the materials, the state does give some flexibility on protecting floodplains and natural resources. And so I'm trying actually to understand a little bit more about what the state is allowing through their middle housing. But I guess I'm still digging on that one.
Yeah, and that might be a good, kind of follow up with Martha offline, because it's, how shall I put this, Martha? It's perhaps not as clear in the state rules as we might hope that it is. But part of the issue is our tree protection standards aren't really implementing one of the statewide planning goals directly. And so that makes it also more complicated for us. And so when we clearly have a goal 5 overlay, like those streams and wetlands I was mentioning, it's much clearer that yes, we can apply our standards, or in floodplains, there's that ability. It's really not clear that we would just be able to somehow say, if you're removing trees, you can't build middle housing, for example. So I think that would be a stretch. And so then it becomes this question, like you said, is do we change our standards for single family? And that's clearly outside the scope of what we're doing in the next 3 months. Is that outside the realm of possibility moving forward? No, it's not, but it becomes obviously a decision that gets made by our policymakers and not by me. So
thank you. I appreciate the information.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Carolyn. I appreciate the call in. Okay, we're going to try Casey Cutting again. Casey, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
Oh, very good. Sorry about that. I'm not good at this Zoom thing. I've only done it once or twice. Okay, so my questions are well, I have a couple questions. What's the guidance on doing like a detached duplex, detached triplex, etc., quadplex, where the buildings are detached, and give somebody who wants to build on a property, the ability to possibly condoize these dwellings to build more affordable housing, smaller, more affordable housing? That's the first question. The second question is, I haven't seen a lot of clear guidance on what the density requirements are. Like we've talked about R7 zone, R10 zone. How do you determine in the past, and I'm familiar with the zoning code, and I've been dealing with it. I've dealt with Jennifer in the past. You have a guidance where you can build, there's a certain amount of land area for each unit and so on. I don't see anything like that in here. And it's a little confusing and hard to make any plans with. So there's that. And sorry, I'm asking multiple questions. The next one is related also to density. How do you determine density for a cottage cluster? And then are there square footage requirements for a cottage cluster? Like the size of the building or dwelling itself? Are they limited to a certain amount of square footage? How does that work?
I'm not going to field all these questions. I'm going to let Martha start, but I just have to say, Casey, if you want to come join our project team, that'd be fine. Because you just asked almost all the same questions that we've been asking. And part of the problem, I guess, is that it doesn't work the way it's ever worked before. And it's hard to wrap our heads around. But with that, I'll let Martha start and then I'll jump in if she misses something that I think is really important.
I'm going to start with density conversation and put off the detached plex conversation for the time being. So you are right. I mean, it is a different way of thinking about density in the R7 and R10 zones. And part of the reason it was so hard to fit into our zoning code is that it is a little bit different way of thinking about things than we have in the past. So what I can say is that in the R7 or R10 zone, the old way of looking at density was based on, in the R10 zone, a 10,000 square foot lot size. So if you had an acre, which is a little over 40,000 square feet, and I'm rounding, a little over 40,000 square feet, you could theoretically get 4 lots, which in the past meant 4 dwellings. Except that you could kind of have 8 dwellings if you built a single family home and an accessory dwelling unit on each of those. So accessory dwelling units kind of already started this idea of density not really tying to the lot size. Middle housing is even different. And so in the R10 zone, let's say you have your 4 lots. You could build a duplex on each of those 4 lots. Or you could build a triplex on each of those 4 lots. Or you could build a 4plex on each of those 4 lots. And so it's really getting a lot harder to tie like actual density to the lot size anymore. And that's just part of the complicated structure of putting middle housing into our single family neighborhoods. When it comes to cottage clusters, it gets even more confusing potentially, because we are not allowed to tell you we're not allowed to have a maximum number of cottages on a site. Rather, you have to figure out, if you want to maximize it, how many cottages can fit on your particular site, and meet all of the other standards, including providing 1 parking space per cottage, including providing a certain amount of courtyard, sort of common open space area. There's a calculation based on how many dwellings, how large your courtyard has to be, and meeting setbacks and things like that. So a cottage cluster has a minimum of 4 dwelling units, but it can have a maximum of however many can fit and meet the development standards. Cottage clusters do have a size limit. They cannot have a footprint larger than 900 square feet for the living space. And they cannot, at least the way the proposal is written, there is a maximum average size across your cottage cluster of 1,400 square feet. So they are intended to be smaller. And they could even be smaller than that if you wanted to maximize the number of cottages on your property, and you could build a fairly large courtyard and you could provide the parking. You could have 500 square foot cottages if you wanted. It just is going to depend on what fits. So we are going to have to start rethinking density, or just thinking about it a little bit differently than we have in the past. So, I mean, hopefully that answers the second and third questions you have. Detached plexes is an interesting conversation. And this is something that has been going on since the state rulemaking for the middle housing. And so traditionally, and I say we, but I think of plexes as attached units. It's a common wall building with 2 units attached to each other. They share some sort of common wall, or a triplex, 3 units attached, or a quadplex, 4 units attached. Through the middle housing rulemaking, it became apparent that there was interest, and there are some jurisdictions that have this thing called detached plexes. And the middle housing rules certainly do allow for that. That's one of the questions that we took out to the public through our outreach. We've talked to our decision-making bodies about, and there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to allowing for that sort of detached product. And without taking all the rest of the time talking about the various advantages and disadvantages, and having a detached product, there was a concern about it potentially being more expensive. There also were concerns about impacting more of the land and open area and or trees. Of course, allowing them would allow for more flexibility for developers. And so at this point in time, our zoning code amendment, the proposal is to call duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes attached, like only allow the attached product. Again, this is something that I think is going to come up in the hearings. I can say that right now, if somebody wants to do a detached duplex type product, they could do a single family dwelling and an accessory dwelling unit. Of course, the accessory dwelling unit does have a size limit. A detached quadplex could be accomplished through the cottage cluster development. It would be required to have a courtyard. And I think, at least at a staff level, we felt like, well, why would anyone ever do the type of development that we want through a cottage cluster and have to build the courtyard if they could just do a detached quadplex? And so we didn't get strong direction, and there weren't a lot of strong feelings generally from the community that we should allow this detached product right now. And so that is not in the proposal. Again, I think it's something that's certainly going to be discussed through the hearings process, and it could be allowed, but we would need to really think about the implications of allowing that.
Great. Thank you very much for the
That was a lot of
call.
words. Did I answer all your questions, Casey? You're still on mute.
I just unmuted. Okay, that cleared up a lot of it. Thank you very much for that. I have a follow-up question, and I think
Casey,
it's a big...
Casey, I do need to go to some other questions here. So why don't you? I'll leave your hand raised, and if we have time, I'll get back to you with it. Is okay?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we probably will get back to Casey, but I want to be sure we get through the people who haven't had their questions answered yet. First, I'm going to stay on the cottage cluster question because we did get an email from David. Hi, I'm in R7. Will individual sewer taps be required in a cottage cluster? If not, how many units could share a tap at the street?
So the answer is we don't know. It is subject to the regulations of the sanitary sewer provider, and I don't know what the trigger is for requiring separate connections versus being able to share one. Martha, we don't know that from our research. Is that correct?
That's correct. I do know if the ultimate plan is to divide the cottage cluster through a middle housing land division, they would be required to have separate sewer lines, but I don't know if that's not the ultimate plan. I don't know what the sewer provider would do.
Okay, very good, thanks. One more quick email, and I'm sorry if I don't understand the full context on this, from Mona Marie. Is middle housing, HB 2001, restricted to fourplex or less per tax lot?
So if I understand the question correctly, it is except in the case of a cottage cluster, where a cottage cluster can have essentially as many units as you can fit on the property and meet all of the development standards.
But I think the important distinction there is that cottages are detached. So we're still not talking about building like, mid-rise buildings that look like apartments. In a cottage cluster, they would each be, they might be a 2-story cottage, but each dwelling unit is going to be separate from all the others. So if we're trying to get it to this, I think people have these questions about what is sort of the bulk or scale of this development maybe going to look like. And if that's the question, then yeah, then cottages, while you could have more, would still not be, you know, stacked high.
Very good. Thank you for the question, Mona Marie. Next, we'll go back to the calls. Tracy Liu. Tracy Liu, you are on. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Very good. Go right ahead.
Hi, good evening. We're located in Johnson Creek, and well, I have a concern regarding this whole affordable housing proposal. And I think it's best said in the following, is that we should maybe step back and look at the current situation and agree, you know, if we could all agree that currently there would appear to be a shortfall of the newcomers looking to purchase housing. And we should also look at the demographics and sort of the type of people that are trying to move here. And we're experiencing growing pains, so to speak, and trying to accommodate them. This is where this is coming from. Am I correct?
Sorry, I tried to unmute. It is coming partly from the need to provide more housing units at different price levels for people. And it's also, quite frankly, coming partly from this single family, the traditional single family neighborhood and its past exclusionary practices, and trying to enable neighborhoods to develop and be able to attract and be able to accommodate different people at different income levels with different needs.
Thank you. So we agree. And I think for the already existing habitants of or citizens here, it's a hard sell to think that our life is going to improve. If we look at, in particular, the property taxes, the assessed values, the max assessed values, what every tax dollar gets us essentially in services from unincorporated Clackamas County, which is notorious in my part of the woods anyway, for, you know, sidewalks, fire hydrants, enforcement of code, etc. People seem to get away with a lot of things here. I just think it's a very hard sell, and I suppose the point I'm trying to make clear here is that as it is, life is rather sweet, and I don't think that unless it's for capital gains, both on you know, property tax for the county and for people owning lots which seem large that can accommodate more housing, I just feel that growing pains, you know, there is a lot more than just homes. There is the whole, you know, the stormwater, the trees, the roads, everything is going to become a little bit more difficult is I suppose the point I'm trying to make. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Tracy, for the comment. Okay, next we're going to go to Natalia Orest. My apologies, Natalia, if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Go right ahead. You are on.
Yes, thank you. So with these changes, would setbacks be affected at all on R10 zoning lot?
No, the proposal is to not change, does not change anything about setbacks for single family homes or for any of the middle housing types except cottage clusters, because the state law requires us to have a little bit smaller rear setback if someone were to build a cottage cluster. So right now it would be 20 feet, but it would have to, we'd have to allow 10 feet for a cottage cluster, but all the other middle housing types would have the exact same setbacks that single family homes have now.
Yeah, and those are 20 feet, you said?
The rear setback is 20 feet, side setbacks are 5 feet, and the front setback is 15 feet, except that you have to have 20 feet to a garage door or carport door, the vehicle door for your garage or carport.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Natalia. Back to an email. Good evening. Would a 0 lot line with a 2 hour firewall, 2 HR, sorry, I'm not sure what the, okay. Would a 0 lot line with a 2 HR firewall be allowed for adjacent townhomes to allow for more density? My thought was 8 townhomes connected. That is from Michael. So again, would a 0 lot line with a 2 HR firewall be allowed for adjacent townhomes to allow for more density? My thought was 8 townhomes connected.
So the requirement for a 2-hour firewall would be something out of the building code, and I don't know if that is specifically the requirement for a townhome at the attachment point. It sounds right, but I can't guarantee that. You'd have to ask our building department. But assuming that it is a 2-hour firewall, townhomes are attached. They have a 0 lot line. So I guess that would be an exception to the setbacks. If you're building townhomes, they are homes that are attached to each other, each on its own lot. There's nothing in the rules that would prevent you from putting 8 in a row. Again, assuming that you meet whatever building code requirements you would have.
All right, very good. And thank you to Michael for the email. We have one last hand up, it looks like, and it's Jeff. I think he was our first caller as well. Jeff, go right ahead if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, hello again.
Yep.
Great conversation. So if I come up with meet with the building, I guess I'm asking my questions about next steps and timeline. So I meet with the planner, I meet with the developer, we come up with the best use for the property. Does it make sense to just submit a plan now, or am I waiting till July to, and what is that? What's the preliminary step and what's the timeline for that next steps?
So I think it depends upon what your ultimate proposal is. If it ends up being to your benefit to partition your property, which I think if I recall, we were talking about the possibility that you could split it into 2 lots under the current zoning, if I remember your question correctly. You could apply for that at any point after you did a pre-application conference. There wouldn't necessarily be a benefit to waiting. If you decide you want to build middle housing on the property, then there isn't anything to turn in right now because we don't have rules that would allow you to do that right now. So you would want to hold off and, you know, kind of at least figure out what the rules, final rules are that are adopted. So you're sure you understand the design standards and the setbacks, because things could still change through these public hearings. So you would just hold off. And then ultimately, if you're building middle housing on existing lots, it's just a building permit. We're not allowed to put it through any kind of land use review unless you're in, say, like a protected habitat area or something like that. But assuming you're not, you're just going to file a building permit and we're just going to review it against what the standards are. Then I guess the question is, if you were going to then divide the middle housing units, that's what we call a middle housing land division. And again, that's not allowed until most likely July 1st. So you would hold off and you would submit that at that point. And I think we still have some questions. You know, Martha and I have talked through this about people in your situation where they might need a division under current zoning in order to get the 2 lots in order to qualify for, say, 2 triplexes, whereas right now you could maybe only do 1 or 1 quadplex. And then does that mean then you have to come back and do the middle housing land division after the fact? And honestly, we're still trying to kind of sort through that. It may be that you have kind of a multi-step process, that you do your partition under the zoning, then you submit your building permits, and then kind of at the same time as you submit your building permits, so you know exactly what you're building, you would propose this middle housing land division, because you have to draw those lot lines right where the, you know, like down the common wall of the duplex or between the cottages. So you have to be really specific. about where each building's going to be on the site in order to be able to file one of those middle housing, divisions. So it's just the timing is going to kind of depend on ultimately what makes the most sense for your site. But I suspect most of this wouldn't be happening until after July 1st.
Okay, because I know that it looks like leaning towards the cottage clusters, and I'm just deciding whether or not the existing home is going to add value, or if it makes more sense just to tear that home down and do a much more complete design. And I don't know, it sounds like on a 18 to 20,000 square foot, we're talking possibly 6 individual addresses.
Yeah, it depends on how small you want your cottages, how many parking spots you can fit, where you're going to put the courtyard and all of that. But in that scenario, you wouldn't need to do a land. If you were going to do a cottage cluster, you wouldn't need to divide the lot to begin.
Right.
So that's actually a savings for you in terms of time and money, I'd say. And you would just design your cottage cluster development to meet the standards that ultimately the board adopts, submit those permits. And then if you wanted to either do a condo plat or to do one of these middle housing land divisions, so each unit could be sold separately, then you would file that kind of simultaneously, probably with the building permits, if you were going to do a middle housing land division. That seems to be how this is going to work. Or it could be after the buildings are all built. You could come back and do it after the fact.
And so it looks like we are waiting until July then.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Thanks very much for that. Excuse me. Thanks very much for that, Jeff. There you go. We are going to get to Casey's follow-up question real quick, and then I saw one more hand go up. So Casey, go right ahead with that follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that has been, I've built built houses and properties for a number of years, and one of the things in the past probably 5-10 years that has been an issue is the extreme rise of the system development charges. And if the goal of the cottage clusters and the affordable housing is to create more housing that is truly affordable, is there going to be some reduced fees for the smaller units? The reason I ask that is that, like, for example, maybe a 900 square foot unit, as a builder, it doesn't cost that much to build, but with the current SDCs that are in place and all the fees that are involved, you could eat up 40+% of the cost of the unit just in SDCs and fees before you even break ground. And that has been among builder friends of mine and I, that has been a big issue, because that's why there's so many larger homes being built, because you can't choke down those extreme fees on smaller units. And that's the really one of the bigger questions I have. And then the second point is, Jennifer, you mentioned you're a task force or something, or I would love to, if you love to talk more about that, if you want to. So.
Okay, well, so I was mostly joking about that just because you asked such really good questions. We didn't do a work group for this particular, for this particular phase of our housing project. It's really been internal, because so much of it is dictated by state law, that there really wasn't sort of a lot of flexibility. We do have more housing work coming though, so stay tuned. You might get recruited yet for something. But to answer your SDC question, and then I'm gonna turn to Martha on this question of smaller units, because I think she may know a little bit about what happened on the transportation SDC. But I want to make, I guess, maybe 3 separate points. One being that one element of House Bill 2001, in addition to the requirement to actually allow middle housing, is that the local government is required to consider, and I think that's the actual word in the statute, to consider essentially some financial incentives for middle housing. It does not mean they have to adopt them, but they have to consider. And one is a construction excise tax, one is property tax programs to incentivize, and one is SDC, waivers or reductions or whatever. So our board will be having the required conversation about those topics. I certainly can't predict any outcomes of that, but there will at least be a discussion about whether they're interested in any of that. I think the second thing is just, for maybe people in the audience who aren't a developer or builder such as you and maybe aren't familiar with systems development charges. So the idea is that these are correlated, at least the methodology would say, correlated to the impact that the development will have on the infrastructure. And so there is a charge that's assessed for various types of infrastructure to accommodate that growth. That's the idea. So of course there's this push-pull. It's kind of another one of those policies like I was talking about with the trees. You've got these competing policy objectives. We're hearing there's not enough infrastructure. It's not high quality enough to support this development. And then on the flip side, that it's driving up the cost of the very development that we want to encourage to house people. And I can't square that circle sitting here, but that's sort of the policy discussion about what you do about that. The third point that I want to make is that the county, unlike some cities, is not in control of all of the SDCs that get charged. For instance, we don't have a water district. Water districts, we have multiple water districts, but they aren't run by the county, so they would charge their own SDC. The county does have a sewer district, it's not technically the county, but certainly it's the same board. But on the other hand, there's Oak Lodge Water Services that runs the sanitary sewer for part of the county. So we're not in control of all of the SDCs. We do have a transportation SDC, and then our board is the Parks District Board too, and there's a systems development charge in North Clackamas Parks District for parks. So we have some control, but not as much control as maybe some cities do over what the sort of total charge is. There has been some work done on our transportation SDC related to unit size, and I don't know, Martha, I don't know if we know off the top of our heads exactly what changed.
I know the gist of what changed, and so as Jennifer mentioned, and I was going to make that point also, that the county has control over really only one system development charge, the transportation system development charge, and that is not generally the largest one. We went through a process a couple of years ago to look at better ways to assess the system development charge. And the outcome of that is that we created sort of different tiers. One of them is a lower system development charge for an accessory dwelling unit. And I think there's actually two charges if your accessory dwelling unit is really small versus a little bit larger. And then there's 3 different tiers for single family dwellings based on the size of the dwelling. And I don't remember off the top of my head what the cutoff is, but I feel like the smallest size is 1,400 square feet or smaller, but don't quote me on that. I can say that there was a lot of discussion about this and about the effects and about the benefits of creating this tiered charge based on the size of the unit. And we did that, but in the whole scheme of things, the difference that the amount that you're saving on the transportation system development charge by building a smaller unit is really a very small portion of the overall system development charges, most of which are the ones that we have no control over. So we've tried, and I don't know if we're going to look at that again in the context of middle housing dwelling units. We certainly could, but I don't think that simply changing the transportation system development charge is going to have the result that you want. It really needs to be the other service providers taking a look at how they assess theirs as well.
Very good. Thank you very much again, Casey, for the questions. Okay, another hand is up. It is from Ryan B. Ryan B, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. Ryan, I have not seen that you have unmuted yourself. I'm going to send you a little notification, ask to unmute. Ryan, if you're there, we can't hear you, and I don't see that you have unmuted yourself. So we'll give you a couple more seconds to try to figure that out. Usually there's a mic thing. That's how it was with Casey. Sorry, Ryan, we cannot hear you, and I've disappeared over there. Okay, well, very good. That is all of the emails and the raised hands that I have seen. So very, very good. I guess we will just go ahead and stop it there. Thank you for joining us tonight. And before we close, I'd like to remind you about the public hearings coming up on this topic in the next couple of months. The Planning Commission public hearing will be held on Monday, March 28th, beginning at 6:30 p.m. The Board of County Commissioners public hearing will be held on Wednesday, April 27th, beginning at 10 a.m. And again, you can always email Ellen Rogland to get on an email list to receive notifications about this project. And you can find her email again on the project page. Let me put that in the chat. And hopefully, I think it was Ryan who was not able to speak due to a mic issue, it looked like. Maybe he can email Ellen and he can get his question answered that way. And with that, I want to thank Ms. Hughes and yes, go right ahead.
I know it's not on the script, I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead.
Regarding the public hearings, you also can submit written testimony, and Dylan had put the address to drop it off on paper or my email address in the chat. And both our Planning Commission and our board really do like to receive the testimony and hear what people have to say.
Very true. Thank you for that, Ms. Fritzy. And I realize I did not put in the chat. I just chatted to ourselves real quick, the address for the website, but I just put it in the chat correctly. So please go ahead and click on that. Anyone in the public who is interested in getting more questions answered or following when the hearings are or getting on the email list and all that. So with that, I'd like to thank Ms. Hughes and Ms. Fritzy for all of us at Clackamas County. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.